Hello, my name is Mia Petrou and this is my EUB343 Assessment 2 piece for Semester 1 2019. My student number is n9970631 and I belong to the tutorial group from 8 till 11 a.m. on a Friday morning. So today obviously I'm going to talk about how my practicum went, how I was able to incorporate different aspects of formative and diagnostic assessment within a particular lesson. So let's jump right into it. My school and classroom context. So I was actually placed in a school that was year 7 to 12. It was a metropolitan co-educational state high school with about approximately 1,800 students, which was quite huge and was a big jump from my last school that I was at. The classroom context for the specific lesson that I had was a year 11 English class. Majority of the class was seen as EALD students, and there was a mixability with range from 18 to 20 students within the class at one time. Now with this school in particular, classes ranged from having either 18 kids or 28 kids. It was just whatever you got. But especially with EALD, they tried to minimize the students just so each student could get enough help and support that they could. All students had to bring their own equipment, so whether that was stationary items or laptops. If they had laptops, then that was completely okay. And if they didn't, then we just had to deal with that and had to do things that weren't including ICTs. Cows were brought into the classroom for this specific lesson. So I had an actual laptop trolley that was brought in so that we could play different games like Kahoot and incorporate ICTs into this lesson, which I thought was a very important part and actually allowed those kids to have a little bit of fun for a formative and diagnostic assessment. So for this specific lesson, the key learning intention was that students will be able to define keywords related to discrimination and use the peel paragraph structure to explain each image. So for this specific lesson, they were talking about discrimination, and the whole unit was basically about discrimination and how it affects the workplace. So what myself and my supervising teacher had noticed over the last few lessons that I had with them was that they weren't quite getting the content and the understanding of what discrimination was and what were the different types of discrimination and how we can define those. So my whole idea for this type of lesson was to A, have students define what discrimination was and be able to understand that, and B, be able to apply that to different scenarios which they'll have to demonstrate within their assessment piece later in the semester. The content descriptor that I used for this year 11 English class was the ways in which main ideas, values, supporting details are represented in social, community and workplace texts. So obviously I was using a lot of workplace texts which they were analysing and pulling out certain types of discrimination, which was very important and actually linked directly to their assessment piece. My diagnostic assessment that I decided to do for these year 11s was a Kahoot. Now I've noticed over my last few practicums that Kahoots go crazy when needed in a classroom setting. So I thought it was really important. I hadn't included ICTs within this class before, so I thought it'd be a good go, have a good go, and obviously extract some diagnostic pieces for myself as a teacher. So this diagnostic assessment was to engage students further and to gauge their understanding of what each type of discrimination was and the differences between them. And I had a range of different questions which ranged from what was the definition of discrimination, what is the definition of adverse action, and then I had different images. So I had a cartoon that they had to pick out the different pieces of discrimination and pick out whether it was like pregnancy discrimination or sexuality discrimination or gender discrimination. So they had to extract those from the image. Students needed to identify discrimination through text, images and videos. So there were videos that were popular culture and that allowed them to incorporate that type of knowledge into the classroom setting. Throughout this diagnostic assessment, myself and my supervising teacher were looking to see if the students fell into the trap of picking common misconceptions, which included defining adverse action as a different type of discrimination. We needed them to understand that these specific types of discrimination definitions were really important to their assessment, and they needed to know each one explicitly and able to pass the criteria sheet for their assessment. The idea of this diagnostic piece was to see what were the common misconceptions and how we could combat that through the lesson and dispel those from the thoughts of the students. So you'll probably see throughout the rest of the lesson, the formative pieces were to either consolidate or to change the different thoughts of the students if they did get the Kahoot wrong. So the example of the diagnostic assessment, as you can see on the screen, there were different questions. So one of them was a definition for discrimination. They had 4 answers to choose from. It was multiple choice. Now, I decided to use multiple choice for this specific class. If it was a grade 11 OP English class or a grade 11 general English class, I probably would leave it. And I wouldn't give them multiple choice. I just have them write out the answer. But for this specific class with the mixed ability range, I thought that multiple choice would be best suited. So you can see there's a definition part. Use the cartoon to see what type of discrimination it was, which was quite interesting, and seeing the different results in that. And then they also had another definition. So those were different types of examples of questions. Now, the analysis of the diagnostic assessment, I put all of the students, basically their results into a table, into an Excel spreadsheet, and collated this whole analysis. So basically in this first table, we have the amount of students that got correct answers and the amount of answers that were incorrect. Now on the bottom axis, we have the 18 students and each student's ability and how many answers they got correct and how many answers they got incorrect. And on the side is how many answers there were. So for example, we've got student number 1 who got 12 answers correct, and they got 5 answers incorrect. So that shows us that basically he was doing quite well, but this student still needed some consolidation with certain aspects of the learning. Whether students 8 got 17 out of 17. So that student was smashing whatever they were doing, and they were like going through the content quite easily. Now, what was good about this different type of analysis was that I could see which students needed quite a lot of help. So for example, student 9, who only got 6 answers correct and needed a lot of help on 9 of the questions. From this analysis, it showed me that some students were doing really well and understood the content, but there was still a fair amount of a majority of the students who needed help with understanding definitions and knowing what discrimination was, and that I needed to form my lesson for the rest of the majority of the time that I was at the school. And also for this lesson, it needed to be a lot more structured than what it was. Now in this second table, on the right-hand side, it shows the number of correct answers for each question. So it showed me that throughout all the questions, when it started off with the definitions and when it finished with the different analysis questions, what students were doing well in. So at the start, you can see everyone knew what discrimination was, and then it started to die down a bit, which is where it got a little bit harder, where they had to define adverse action and those difficult definitions, which we were trying to catch them on and trying to see the different misconceptions. It then peaked again up, where it was easy to identify the different types of discrimination, so whether it was pregnancy discrimination, ageism, sexuality discrimination, those types of things. Then it dipped back down when it came to actually looking at a video and going, okay, what are the different types that I can see in this video that aren't as clear as in an image? Then it pops back up again for different images that were quite clear. So that, as a teacher, gave me an overall understanding of how many students could gauge the different types of understandings, and also for me, have an understanding of what content as a class, do they really know, and what content they don't know. For this, that's basically what we can see. So from graph 1, we can gather how each student participated and the overall number of incorrect answers. It shows that there's a mixed ability as well. For graph 2, this allows the teacher to determine how much time needs to be spent on certain areas of content rather than other areas. So I took that class data from graph 2 and actually incorporated that in a couple of other lessons, just so I knew that I didn't have to focus so much on images and more like videos and definitions of certain types of discrimination. The learning experience itself. So as a school, they have adopted this analysis strategy called poses. Now in the poses, analysis. Students are able to understand and extract who are the people in the image, the objects in the image, the scenario or the setting, the emotion or the effect that this may have on the audience or viewers, the relationships that is between the people in the image, and then students summarize all these points into a linking sentence. Now, for EALD students, I found that this analysis strategy works a lot better than other analysis strategies because it gets them to differentiate between each point, and it allows them to write things in dot points and then collate it all at the end in a summarized sentence. Throughout the learning experience, I used the I do, we do, you do framework, as I found this was a structure that worked and was a lot more effective. So for this specific poses practice, I actually went through with the students and gave them different starting sentences for the POSE, and then students were able to do the relationships by themselves and summarize their whole argument by themselves as well. So I gave them the POS, we together as a class did the E, and then the R was done by themselves individually. Now for my formative assessment strategy, I decided to go a little bit above and beyond for these students because for their assessment piece, they needed to write a pure paragraph. And it was coming close to their assessment piece. They needed to know the content, but they also needed to know how to write a pure paragraph. So by extending students to write their own poses analysis and then transform their notes into pure paragraphs, allowed me as the teacher to see how well the students have understood the content. There was also a focus on focus correction areas to follow, which is in adherence with John Collins' evidence-based writing strategies. So John Collins is an American writer who basically studied at Harvard and basically came up with this writing strategy which uses type 1, type 2 and type 3 writings. He said that the most effective way to enhance a student's writing is by teaching sequentially and having a focus area for students to follow. So as you can see on the screen over here, there was focus areas that the students had to follow when they were writing their pure paragraph. So as it was an EALD class, I made sure that there was some focus correction areas that people could follow quite easily, and then some that would push the other students who had quite a high ability. So there was correct punctuation, which students had to circle. They had to explain a type of discrimination in their response, and they had to underline it so I could see as a teacher that it was clear. They needed to have a summary sentence that is 25 words long. So at the end of their poses, they need to have 25 words long. And they needed to use the correct peel structure and use a squiggly line to show where each section was. Now, in the next few examples, you'll see that this wasn't necessarily adhered to. Students didn't circle or underline these, but I was able to see it embedded into their examples, which was awesome. The formative assessment specifically tested students' knowledge and built understanding from the diagnostic assessment. It allows students to think critically and analytically rather than just analysing certain issues. So what I could see from the diagnostic assessment was that students could pick out the issues, but they couldn't necessarily analyse them well or critically think about them. So what I wanted to do with this whole formative assessment strategy was actually use Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom's taxonomy states that the importance of allowing students growth throughout the lesson is to eventually reach and attain critical thinking skills. So by the end of this formative assessment strategy, I wanted the students to be able to think critically and analytically and be able to analyze those really important parts of the image and the videos to pick out certain types of discrimination. So as we can see in this formative assessment piece, they had an image which basically talked about Izzy Folau's controversial media post that he posted on Instagram. And this was actually one of the Year 12's assessment piece items. So it was getting them ready for Year 12 as well, which was okay with the supervising teacher. So an example that I have from a student basically shows the correct poses analysis, which was fantastic. The student had 25 words summary sentence, which was great, and it analysed and summarised the whole image as a whole, which was great. The peel paragraph, it shows that she's got a PEEL, which is great. It shows the structure. It talks about, so the image shows Israel Folau engaging in mean comments on a public social media platform. Israel Folau used his social status to share hate and prejudice, and produce content similar to direct discrimination. In his post, he refers to homophobia, transphobia, and other aspects of discrimination. So already she's used direct discrimination, which is a definition used in the diagnostic assessment piece. They've stated homophobia, transphobia, and other aspects of discrimination, which is also things that were talked about in the diagnostic piece. So as from this formative assessment piece, as a teacher, I can see that students are using what they've learned at the start of the lesson and what they've basically been reminded of in the diagnostic assessment piece and used it within their formative assessment piece in the middle of the lesson. Now, my final formative assessment piece was an exit slip. So after they had done their poses, their peel paragraph, they needed to do an exit slip. And the exit slip was to gauge each student's understanding of the effect that a specific type of discrimination can have on the workplace. As a teacher, I reviewed all of these responses after class, then gave feedback the next lesson regarding the common misconceptions that were found. And this was done through just a conversation where students wrote down what they needed to work on at the start of the lesson. As a teacher, I reviewed all of these responses after class, then gave them feedback the next lesson. Common misconceptions included students not knowing the definition of an effect, which was quite clear, and I could quite easily turn that around next lesson, which was a good thing. This was a small amount of students. It was still addressed the next lesson. So we can see at the top here in example one student said that it lowers an effect that discrimination can have is it lowers views within the workplace, and it can make your company lose buyers and people's respect. It said that gender discrimination will make people not want to visit their work. It's a fair comment. And the company may go bust. So another one that a student said was gender discrimination could make workers feel like they wouldn't fit in at work, which was a really good example, and it was a good effect. And another one said that men treating women differently within a workplace could be an effect of sexism. Gender discrimination, women getting called weak, so those types of things could have an effect on the workplace, which was really good and basically demonstrated to me as a teacher that students understood what discrimination was, understood the concept of discrimination, and then was able to determine different effects. So at the start of the lesson, it was evident that many students throughout the course of the diagnostic assessment were confused of how to analyse certain images that represented a certain aspect of discrimination. But within the formative assessment piece and the final formative assessment piece, the overall number of students who were able to correctly identify the aspect of discrimination portrayed and successfully analyse the image was outstanding. Now, when I did and collated all the data for the start of the lesson, so the diagnostic assessment, collated all the data for the formative assessment, I came up with two different numbers. So at the start of the lesson, 32% of students understood how to analyse an image and identify the correct aspect of discrimination in the diagnostic assessment piece. Now, this was quite worrying for me as a teacher because I knew I needed to improve that to over 50%, more than 50% by a lot. So I did a lot of work to get them to understand throughout this lesson what discrimination was and how we can analyse and identify different parts of discrimination through images and texts. By the end of the lesson, so after doing the final formative assessment and the formative assessment in the middle of the lesson, 87% of students understood how to analyse an image and identify the correct aspects of discrimination by the final assessment piece. So this was quite a big difference from 32% to 87%. I was quite stoked as a teacher, to be quite honest, to know that majority of students had quite a great understanding of what discrimination was and how they could analyse that through the use of text and images. Those are my references. So I obviously talked about Bloom's taxonomy. I used the Australian curriculum to help me form my lesson, and John Collins, who was the